Hello everyone, it's wonderful to be joining you as part of this series on inclusive bioethics methodologies. I'm Mehrunisha. I'm an associate professor and director of medical ethics and law education at the University of Oxford. And today what I'm going to be sharing with you is a few thoughts about the challenges that researchers encounter when it comes to consent processes, but in particular, the enrollment and participation of Muslim women in research. This work is based off of research that I did as part of my DPhil at the University of Oxford, looking at the role of Islam in biomedical research ethics, and in particular, work that I did incorporating empirical studies that were conducted in Malaysia and Iran. I'll tell you a little bit about what the core findings of the thesis were, which has been published as a monograph by Routledge. There were 4 key findings of the research. The first was that it was very, very clear from literature, guidelines, as well as the empirical work that I did, that Islam plays a pivotal role in terms of its institutions, as well as religious scholarly authorities in informing and determining the boundaries of what constitutes appropriate research, but also what constitutes good research. Not only that, when we encounter global health challenges such as the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there are practical but also ethical issues that require engagement from Islam's institutional components. And I'll give you an example of that. For example, in countries where HIV/AIDS was a considerable challenge, there was a recognition that interventions needed to be researched but also rolled out and audited to try and reduce transmission amongst intravenous drug users. Illicit drug use is considered immoral in Islam, and although this was considered a norm, in all of the settings that I looked at, there was very deep, rigorous, but also pragmatic engagement. On the one hand, to not compromise religious views, values, and commitments, but on the other, to try and think very, very carefully about the global health challenge that HIV/AIDS posed, but also on the individual humanitarian level, what can be done to offer support, protection for those who were using IV drugs. And those sorts of interactions, those sorts of engagements reveal that the institution of Islam needs to be aware of, but also needs to be responsive to biomedical research and global health challenges. The third key finding was that in the context of biomedical research, the consent and enrollment of Muslim women was a particular challenge for researchers. And in the rest of the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, so I won't dwell on that too much now. And finally, what the research also highlighted was that people's faith commitments were incredibly important when they were deliberating what constitutes an ethical problem in the research context, but also how they go about deliberating and solving that. And some of that will come to light when we talk about the specific case of women's autonomy, their consent and participation in research. Through this presentation, what I will tell you a little bit more about is a background to Islamic ethics. I promise it will be light touch, but I will be sharing with you some resources that may be helpful. And then in terms of the research in and of itself, I'll talk you through some of the existing literature and guidelines on biomedical research ethics and the role of Islam and this particular issue of women's consent. and I will summarize the empirical study in Malaysia and Iran. And finally, we'll take a look at how it is these discussions, but also these empirical realities, have implications for broader bioethics. And I think it's important at this juncture to say that many of us may feel that autonomy and consent in the research context is something that's a settled issue. It's perceived more as a procedural problem, one that requires forms, sufficient approval from recs, but it isn't something that provokes complex dilemmas and deliberations. What my research shows is for people for whom religious commitments are important, but also where their views and values challenge our understandings of what we mean by autonomy and consent, there's a need for bioethics as a field, but also bioethicists to engage with some of these nuances, contextual challenges, in order for the field to be richer with that empirical reality, but for there to be more deliberation about what it is researchers encounter, what support they have and don't have, in order for participation of women and others to be fair and ethical in the context of research. Let's spend a little bit of time thinking about what we mean by Islamic ethics. Islam is one of the Abrahamic religions, and its observers, Muslims, consider two key sources as their foundation for moral reasoning. And this is in terms of rules and regulations when it comes to broader issues, but also more day-to-day granular issues. And so Muslims would consider that Islam influences every aspect of their lives. And the two sources that they rely on is the Quran, which they consider to be the word of God, as well as hadith, or the sayings, the example of the Prophet Muhammad. There has been a lot of work during the medieval period extracting principles, normative dicta from these primary sources by scholars such as Ibn Sina, Avicenna, Ghazali, and others, in terms of broader moral commitments for Muslims, and in contexts where Islam is predominant. Within the medical field, some of you will be familiar that Islam, its sources, as well as scholars, have been engaged with issues pertaining to clinical ethics for a very, very long time, especially when it comes to ethics around the beginning of life, such as the moral status of the embryo, as well as at the end of life when we think about withholding and withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. Where there has been a paucity of research and literature is around biomedical research ethics. What constitutes good research for Muslims and within an Islamic framework is very, very poorly understood. And in particular, the status of women when we're thinking about research whose broader commitments are generating knowledge, not even necessarily benefiting the individual participants. And the reason that's important within the Islamic worldview is that the status of women has been something that's been debated and discussed since its inception, but continues to this date. What I mean by that is that there are plentiful verses in the Quran that talk about men and women having an equal status, or all beings having an equal status in terms of their spiritual commitments. Yet there are verses in the Quran, for example, verse 34 in chapter 4, that in some interpretations is understood as men having a responsibility to protect and to maintain women. And the way in which this has been interpreted, applied, is that women's autonomy needs to be viewed differently, and this plays out in the clinical context, but it's weighed up differently in terms of benefits and harms. When it's a patient requiring care, there is a more categorical understanding that a woman's health is of paramount importance, and any deliberations about relational autonomy or the involvement of a male spouse or guardian may be secondary. In the research context, this is something that is more nuanced, more debated, and we'll come on to that in subsequent slides. What I did as part of the DPhil research is to look at existing literature and guidelines, and although there was a paucity of both, one of the things that became clear was that researchers commented avidly on the role of Muslim women in the context of their centrality to the family. One of the researchers, for example, Afifi, writes that it's necessary for women who want to be enrolling in participants to get their family approval, i.e. the approval of a male guardian, be that a father, a husband, or someone who's a recognized male authority. Other views in the literature challenge this perspective, and they say that this is re-emphasizing patriarchal norms, and it infringes on the rights of women. For example, Fadl holds this view. And what I also did was, beyond the literature, tried to look at, well, how does this play out within guidelines, either national, international, or institutional level guidelines? And there were very few guidelines that even looked at research ethics from the perspective of Islam and Muslims. But there was an international guideline that's produced by the Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences, and the IOMS guidelines is an adaptation of the CIOMS guidance, which is an incredibly important international guideline. The IOMS guideline, although it comments that women's autonomy ought to be upheld, it mentions that it would be preferable for a male guardian's permission to be sought. What this means is that we find there is huge disagreement in the literature, and there's also a lack of clarity in the guidelines about what researchers ought to do when they're thinking about consenting and enrolling women into research. Not only that, when we think about the marginalization of women in healthcare research more broadly, what's not very well understood is, are these sorts of provisions or these opacities ways in which women face further barriers, or are there ways in which enrollment of women can be sustained and addressed better? And so these are the sorts of questions that I was seeking to answer when I went into the empirical component. And I spoke to researchers, research ethics guideline producers, research ethics committee members in Malaysia and Iran. And what I found was, in both countries, guidelines weren't explicit about whether researchers should be co-consenting women with their spouse or with a male guardian. But when I interviewed researchers, many of them explained that this was a challenge that they faced very, very commonly. Either women themselves were hesitant about their participation in research, particularly if it meant that researchers would have to come regularly to their home, or if it had some implications on time with their family, or if it had healthcare implications such as fertility that would require deliberation with other family members. In Malaysia, neither guidelines nor did committee members have any protocol that had general agreement on this. Part of this was to reflect the multicultural, the multi-ethnic, multi-faith makeup of Malaysia. But not only that, there was a huge commitment to attract international collaborations, international funding. And so a lot of the stakeholders expressed that it would be restrictive to have guidelines that were specific to a particular cohort of the population. In Iran, although the guidelines weren't explicit, what I found incredibly valuable to appreciate was that given Iran's predominant male population and the role of Islamic authority in legislation, prioritization of healthcare policy, including research, there was critical engagement by religious scholars, but also other stakeholders in thinking about women's enrollment and participation in research. And there, what they agreed was that this wasn't about men and women in isolation. We need to be thinking about autonomy in terms of the family. And if there are issues that research throws up that are to do with the family, to do with the home, then it's not just important for the woman, but also for the man to consider who else needs to be involved in that decision-making process. And that is the sort of thing researchers ought to be aware of. There was considerable disagreement amongst researchers in Iran about this, and I won't delve into that in more detail, but for those of you who are interested, I'd be very, very happy to share resources. The summary of these deliberations and discussions was that autonomy within Muslim contexts is different, but it does throw up practical and ethical challenges, especially when we think about the context of domestic and intimate partner violence. Researchers said that they wanted to do that type of research. They wanted to do it ethically and in a way that was cognizant of cultural and religious norms, but it was incredibly challenging, particularly when women didn't feel safe or they had religious commitments that meant they were unsure of how they ought to be engaging with this kind of research. Let's now take a step back and think about what all of these sorts of findings mean in terms of broader bioethics. And there's been considerable work when we're looking at issues around consent and autonomy and the implications of different cultural and religious contexts. Authors such as Ruth Macklin talk about the problems of relativism in that it may undermine universal values and human rights. Not only that these kinds of commitments may lend authority to male-dominant views and legitimize patriarchy, particularly in contexts where women are vulnerable and they can't challenge the status quo. For me, what I found incredibly important to appreciate in these sorts of contexts is that women themselves are deeply faithful. They rely on religious views, values, and norms for meaning making, and their moral universe is deeply informed by these religious commitments. And so it presents this challenge of how we uphold people's human rights, their sensitivities, how we grapple with not deepening injustices and inequalities, but at the same time being cognizant of their realities. Not only that, the empirical work as well as the guidelines and the literature and the tensions within them showed that researchers, both Muslim and non-Muslim, have to grapple with incredibly complex issues on a day-to-day where they have very little resources. There's no guidelines, there isn't a toolkit, there isn't a deliberation space where they can share with others the sorts of experiences they have or share best practice. Not only that, many of them expressed that it was incredibly challenging for them to be doing this in a way where they didn't feel guilt, where they didn't feel that they were potentially excluding women or potentially perpetuating the sorts of inequalities, injustices, and harms that they were committed to mitigating and addressing. In terms of the theoretical considerations, I think some of this empirical work challenges the stark dichotomy of universalism and relativism. Maybe what we need to do is appreciate the complex moral realities that researchers face in these sorts of contexts where participants have deep religious commitments, but not only that, when researchers themselves hold deep faith values. And it's a pluralist approach to good research that may help, acknowledging the complex moral nexus and universes that we all carry within us and encounter, so that we can ensure the safety and ethical participation of women in research. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time. I wanted to briefly acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Ray Fitzpatrick, as well as Professor Mike Parker, in supporting this research, without whom none of this would have been possible, as well as the ETHOP Centre and the Nuffield Department of Population Health for their support. There are a few references that I have cited here. There's a huge plethora of literature for those of you who are interested in Islamic ethics, as well as Islamic biomedical research ethics, works by Professor Abdulaziz Sachedina, as well as Professor Mohammed Ghali. But I will stop there, and if any of you are interested, please do get in touch, and I'd be very, very happy to share more resources and chat more. Thank you so much.